Welcome to the CAA 2021 webinar series. Today's webinar is Sustainable Ambulance with Alexis Percival. Thanks for joining us and please enjoy.
Hi, my name is David Waters and I'm the Chief Executive of the Council of Ambulance Authorities. Welcome to the latest in our webinar series. Today we're going to take another look at sustainability, and our presenter on this occasion is Alexis Percival from the UK. The CAA is committed to working with our members towards a more sustainable future for the ambulance sector. To start this process, we have created the Sustainability Strategy for the CAA. The speaker today will help us understand what we need to do as a sector to work towards a more sustainable future. Alexis is the Environmental and Sustainability Manager for the Yorkshire Ambulance Service based in Yorkshire in the UK. She started as the first sustainability manager for an ambulance service in the country in 2009. She's in charge of the Carbon Management and Reduction Programme, rolling out a carbon champion scheme and installing innovative low-carbon technologies across the estate. Alexis has worked on developing low to zero emission ambulances with innovative low-carbon fleet technologies. She is also facilitating the rollout of the EV charging infrastructure for the ambulance service fleet. She's also investigating the challenges of decarbonising the ambulance service through renewable technologies, net zero ambulance station design, phasing out of Entonox, and looking at alternative models of care. At the end of the session, Alexis is going to join us for a live Q&A session. Which is a big deal because it's probably the middle of the night for Alexis in the UK. So join me in welcoming Alexis. We really look forward to this presentation and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from it. So Alexis, welcome. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Alexis Percival. I'm the Environmental and Sustainability Manager here at Yorkshire Ambulance Service in the UK. The climate emergency is a health emergency. And we realise in the NHS in the UK that we have to tackle this head on. Here is climate change in action. In the past 140 years, we have changed our environment beyond recognition, superheating it to the point that we are in dire straits. The World Economic Forum has, on an annual basis, recognises the impact of various different things across the world on the economics and the financial markets. And this year they have identified that climate change of various different elements will directly affect us in so many different ways, from climate action failure to biodiversity loss, extreme weather, water crises, natural disasters, human-made environmental disasters and infectious diseases. All of these are already starting to have an impact on the way that our environment is changing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have stated that we need to limit our carbon emissions below 1.5 degrees. What this actually means is that our carbon emissions, as in CO2, carbon dioxide emissions equivalent, need to be below a certain amount. And this is what the different scenarios look like. So the RCP, or the representative concentration pathway, needs to be below around 400 parts per million. If we don't get it right and we don't reduce our carbon emissions, this is actually what it will look like. So the UK climate projections 2018 have actually predicted that if we look at the worst case scenario, the RCP at 8.5, we will be looking internationally and across the globe at around a 4 to 8 degree temperature rise by the year 2100. For the UK, this means that we will be looking at warming during the summers being a lot hotter, and we'll end up with wetter environments during the winter. But we'll also be looking at a sea level rise around the UK coastline that will disastrously affect our coastal communities. So where we're at this present moment in time is we are have a 1.2 degrees temperature rise in comparison to the pre-industrial temperature rise. But this means with the current pledges and targets that we have in place, we are looking at around a 3 degree temperature rise by the end of this century. And And with policies that are in place as well, we're probably looking around 4 degrees if we don't start to rein it in. In reality, we need to get more people on board in order to kind of achieve the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, and we need to reduce and eliminate our carbon emissions as fast as possible. This is what's actually been happening since 1998. The past 20 years, we've warmed our temperatures over around 5.5 degrees, which is meaning on an annual basis, we are presently at the warmest temperatures that we've ever experienced. What this means in reality is we will end up with various tipping points which may potentially shift our temperature rise beyond the point of no control. And these include, if we heat our temperatures past that 1.5 to 2 degrees, we will end up with mass disintegration of the ice shelf in the Antarctic. We'll end up with an Amazon rainforest dieback, permafrost loss, which will in turn lead to a loss of the permafrost, which will lead to an increase in the amount of methane released to atmosphere, which will end up with more tipping points and more warming. How does this actually affect us in the health service? Across the planet, we're already experiencing more flooding, more heat waves, more moorland fires, which are leading to increased pressure on us as the ambulance service, but also more breathing problems and more impacts on the patients that we're having to deal with. Our patients are having issues with us having access to them, and also having emergency response times increasing. So we're having to drive through floodwaters, which is putting us and our patients at risk. And we don't have any red routes to hospitals, i.e. something that is raised to ensure that if we have flooding, we have access at all times to hospitals. Sea level rise and storm surges are also having a massive impact on our hospitals. But also we're set to have a rise in the number of pandemics that we will have an experience over the next few years. We are in the midst of COVID across the planet, but MERS, SARS, monkeypox, bird flu are likely to have an increase, as well as things like the plague and other pandemics across the planet. How has it been affecting us in the UK? These are photographs from my paramedics on the road, and as you can see, we got very badly affected by flooding over the past few years. This has had a dire effect on our staff and our patients. We've also experienced flash floods, which have taken out road infrastructure, and also we've experienced moorland fires, which have directly impacted people around the area, but also impacted wildlife, as well as an increase in the amount of call-outs to patients with breathing problems. But also our staff have experienced problems in actually getting to hospitals, with roads being blocked through flooding. At the same time, we've had extreme droughts that have meant that there's been water pressures across the area as well. We experienced a paramedic who was stranded in water and ended up with hypothermia, as well as the patient. But we've also, our helicraft crew have also had problems and had to step into the void where we can't get on the ground crew, can't get to patients as well. But our infrastructure and our estates have also experienced flooding and impacts from climate change as well. Within the UK, we are set to have sea levels rise by about 3 millimetres a year, and we're expecting to experience metre sea level rise by 2100, which will put major pressures on our coastal communities. But we have around 5 million people that are likely to experience flooding by 2080, and that is only 60 years. And on an annual basis, this will lead to mass displacement of people, with financial ramifications, loss of housing, as well as psychological and mental health problems that will affect them. But we'll also experience mass displacement of people across the planet. So to kind of put it in context, a 1 metre sea level rise will take out many of our coastal communities, but we are likely to experience by 2300, if we don't get and control our carbon emissions, a 3 metre sea level rise. Potentially by 2300, the UK climate projections have predicted that we will experience a 13 metre sea level rise, which means my county in the north of England will experience island formation. But with many of the tipping points being an option, we could experience a 50 metre sea level rise. But you don't live in the UK, so this may not an impact to you. So I've looked at Australia. Although you're a continent by yourself, it's something that will directly affect you, maybe not quite as much of an impact, but areas like South Australia, Northern Territory will start to be affected. Some parts of Sydney and Melbourne at 1 to 3 metres, you could end up with quite serious coastline loss. A 13-metre sea level rise will lose quite a lot of areas in Queensland and Northern Territory, quite high loss around your coastlines at 50 metres. We have had an increase in the amount of natural disasters that have affected us across the planet, and it's quite stark when you start to look at how many more storms, how many more wildfires, flooding incidents we've experienced in the past 20 years. In 2018, there was 315 reported disasters with over 11,000 people dying from the experiences, and around 68 million people that have been directly affected by these natural disasters. The economic damage in 1 year was around $132 billion. It is and will continue to happen across the planet, and it will directly affect us with the mass movement of people. So India is in the process at the moment. 20 of the top cities are likely to run out of groundwater. It didn't happen last year, but potentially with the heat waves, it could happen on an annual basis. You've experienced wildfires in Australia, but also in California, they ended up with major wildfires that wiped out their seaboards. There's been hurricanes that have been affecting many parts of the world. There's been droughts in South Africa where they've nearly run out of water altogether. In Siberia, there was a mass wildfire that ripped through most of the northern part. There's been locust infestations that swarmed all the way from Saudi Arabia and Yemen all the way down to Tanzania, wiping out many crops, and at the present moment in time is having a major impact on Ethiopia. But also you have the consequences of some of the climatic changes in Australia this very second with your mouse plague that you have. Heat waves are set to cost the NHS many millions of pounds. And we are likely to have more and more deaths on an annual basis. There was 2,000 people that died in 2003. In France, there was around 7,000 people just a few years ago, and it's likely to increase on an annual basis. This is what's called the climate stripes, and you can see there's been a dramatic increase in the temperature rise in more recent years. This is and will continue to have an impact across the planet, and we need to start to control our carbon emissions. There's been some temperature anomalies in this past year, this past month, but as you can see, we are still heating the world. And in the Arctic, where a lot of the ice is locked up, we're nearly 30 degrees above the normal temperature. The economic cost of climate change will be between £160 billion and £300 billion by 2030. We have a major challenge. Increase in failure of crops as we kind of move upwards, and which will lead to pressures on food stocks. We'll end up with water problems from sea level to mountain glaciers melting, and we're going to end up with a mass extinction problem as well. The extreme weathers are feedbacks, events that will happen across the planet are set to increase as we kind of creep forwards. But the impacts on the health service will have more of an impact through the health system and the health of the human population. We're set to have more and more mental health problems that from flooding, heat wave issues, an increase in skin cancer, heart attacks, breathing problems, COPD, asthma, and an increase in the amount of insect vector carrying diseases that will occur through increase and change in weather patterns. But across the planet, there'll be more and more malnutrition, an increase in pandemics, as well as things like dehydration, kidney issues, as well as fetal abnormalities that will occur. Climate change is already starting to have an impact on the health system, and we will have more and more challenges that we will have to face through the flash floods, the surface water flooding, storms, high winds, heat, drought, and sea level rise. We need to start tackling this now, because there will be more and more deaths through the incidents that occur. But also there'll be with every 1 degree temperature rise, there'll be more and more pressures on our accident emergencies across the planet. And that's not just through the temperature, but it'll be through conflicts, through fighting, through issues that occur with that as well. So the climate crisis is a health crisis, and we need to work out how we can tackle our impact as the health system. The healthcare sector accommodates and is attributed to 4.4% of the global net emissions. And if we were a country, it would be around the 5th largest country and emitter in the world. So we have a major responsibility and we need to tackle this. Australia features in the top circle as such of the top 10 emitters as a percentage of global healthcare, behind the US and China. So you have to look at this as a major problem, but also a major challenge and a major financial benefits for tackling this as well. 2019 has changed the world's healthcare system from looking at the impacts of this, from the rise of strident strikes across the planet, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion. We are looking to tackle this, and we have to tackle it. It has raised it up the agenda. Last year, the NHS, which is the National Health Service here in the UK, was challenged to become a greener NHS. We are the 3rd largest organisation on the planet, with around 1.5 million people within the healthcare system, with another 1.5 million in the health and social care system. And we have a huge opportunity to tackle this. We're responsible for around 4 to 5% of the UK's carbon footprint, around 7% of the road traffic at any one time. But we have the challenge that 7% of our hospitals are built on floodplains, as well as our general practitioners, our GPs, health service centres, and most of our ambulance stations as well. By tackling climate change, we can actually reduce the impact on the health system from air pollution, heat waves, extreme weather, as well as extreme rainfall and flooding. So in 2020, the NHS was challenged to become a greener NHS, recognising that the health emergency is a climate emergency and the climate emergency is a health emergency. They are both interlinked. The NHS, along with the rest of the UK, is challenged to become net zero by 2050, but the NHS decided to go one step further. So looking at the Scope 1 and the Scope 2 emissions, the NHS carbon footprint was challenged to look at the NHS carbon footprint to become a net zero by 2040 for most everything we can control in our Scope 1 and 2 emissions. In our Scope 3 emissions, which is everything else, our procurement, our supply chain stuff, as well as our patient and visitor travel, we are looking at a 2045 target. So by 2045, the whole of the NHS, nearly 3 million people, need to eliminate our carbon emissions completely. But the journey doesn't just start the year beforehand, it needs to start now, because many of these things need to have a change. The carbon impact is enormous. So we contribute around 20 million tonnes of carbon emissions on an annual basis. So we need to work out how we get down to 2045 to eliminate our carbon emissions. Each part of the NHS contributes different parts, different things, and different parts of the system have different elements. So the carbon emissions for the ambulance service are quite small in comparison to everyone else. But at the same time, we have a real opportunity to change and work collaboratively with the rest of the NHS. The NHS as a whole has different parts of the system contributing different carbon emissions. So most pharmaceuticals sit within, they contribute around a quarter of the emissions. But there are different elements through electricity, gas, fuel, as well as staff commuting and waste and ICT as well. So in 2010, we set up a group called the Green Environmental Ambulance Network with all of the ambulance services across the whole of the UK. And we share all our sustainability challenges and we work to look at our carbon footprint, look at adaptation plans, to how we can deal with our carbon emissions for the future, but also how our estate needs to challenge that. But we also have looked at our EV charging infrastructure, looking at NOx reduction. We solely use NOx as our analgesic and anaesthetic gases. Also, we're looking at the ambulance station of the future, as well as plastic reduction, ambulance design, reusable face masks, glove reduction, and net zero targets. So we've laid out a plan up to 2045 in order to eliminate our carbon emissions and what we need to do in order to tackle all of that. So starting point is looking at having a green plan with a clear strategy to eliminating carbon emissions. But also we're looking at what we need to do for our vehicles, our estate, our lighting systems, looking at what we need to do in order to tackle our procurement, as well as looking at phasing out fossil fuels across the system and ensuring that we are ready for a climate that can be very uncertain if we don't achieve it. I've been in this post for over 10 years. We looked at various different things, from waste through to how we train our staff on driving, to putting in renewables, looking at our infrastructure for staff to get to work, as well as our water systems through toilets, having push-stop taps. But also we work with other parts of the system to look at what we could do to tackle climate change issues as well. But also we're tackling biodiversity, we're planting trees, we're allowing staff to have allotments on site and making sure that we get wildflower meadows in as well. But we're looking to future-proof, so we're putting in EV charging points, education programmes, ensuring that staff look at how they get to work through car sharing, bike to work schemes, as well as working with our partners in the fire, police and the highway sector, as well as the army. We've also looked at what we need to do to tackle plastic reduction, and we've looked at our staff canteen and eliminated around 200,000 bits of plastic, which has in turn led to various other initiatives like Warp It, where we recycle all of our furniture and we share with the charities around the system as well. But one of our biggest challenges more recently is to do with face masks and PPE, and coronavirus has really highlighted the amount that we rely on single-use products. This has kind of looked at us to look at the challenge of looking at alternatives, and we've introduced reusable face masks which can be reused up to 50 times and then repurposed or recycled back into the cloth manufacturing system. And in doing so, we've actually eliminated our waste altogether. So our fleet is our big challenge, but procurement will be an even bigger challenge because we have around 30,000 products that we need to tackle. But within my ambulance service, we have around 12,000 vehicles, 404 of them being ambulances. We have rapid response vehicles, which are smaller cars. And we have a patient transport service that we move patients to and from hospital to their houses as well. We drive around 35 million miles a year, and we only at the present moment in time have 1% of our fleet being electric. We've been running some trials with hydrogen, but most of our fleet is diesel. But to kind of quote the Hippocratic Oath, we have around, we need to look at protecting people, and we're contributing to the early death of 8 people within our area from air quality issues associated with diesel use. So we need to look at what we need to do with fleet. So we identified a Road to Zero challenge, and we've been looking at what we need to do in order to eliminate diesel from our fleet. There are around 1,000 ambulance stations around the whole of England, with around 14,000 vehicles that we need to tackle and move from diesel vehicles to alternative ultra-low and zero-emission vehicles. The NHS has challenged us by 2028 we need to have 90% of our fleet being ultra-low emissions and 25% of them being zero emissions. So we have a real challenge ahead of us, because in 2030 all diesel and petrol sales of new vehicles will be banned, and we need to eliminate 80% of our emissions by 2030. We need to look at these alternatives. In order to do that, we need to upgrade our infrastructure, and we need to have grid upgrades for the power electricity supply as well. But also we need hydrogen infrastructure, we need to look at fast recharging, and we need funding. At the present moment in time, there's no charging at A&E, only 140 charging points for the whole of the UK ambulance service. So we have a real challenge ahead of us in order to do so. We started many years ago looking at the actual ambulance and to look at what we needed to do to change it. And we looked at aerodynamics, and we've gone through a process of looking at how we can change and improve the fuel efficiency of those vehicles through that. We carried out some designs, assessments, and we looked at how the airflow could be changed by having an aerodynamic light bar on the roof. and we ended up with a more integrated light bar rather than a standalone or stand proud one. We went through a lightweighting program and changed all of our lighting in the back of our ambulances to LED. Also tested out new technologies with a methanol fuel cell in the back to look at auxiliary power and what we needed to do on our vehicles to keep them warm during winter, but also provide power for any kind of supporting stuff that we needed. We've also looked at new technologies like having solar panels on the roof, and we have 120 ambulances that have solar panels installed in the back that supplies top-up electricity to the back of the vehicles. We've also tested out new vehicles from electrics to hybrids, and they all have different challenges because we're quite a rural ambulance service. Many would work in city centres but don't really work out in the remoter areas, or the downtime for recharging is challenging. We've also got quite a few hydrogen vehicles on our fleet, and we run a hydrogen diesel patient transport vehicle, as well as hydrogen electric vans that we've been trialling, and they all work exceedingly well. Most bar the hydrogen diesel have zero tailpipe emissions. And it's really shown that we can move over to hydrogen and electric as a range aspect. We have a hydrogen refueling station, and the UK government is looking to roll out more across our patch as well. So this is our hydrogen diesel conversion that we carried out with Ulemco, and it's been very well received by staff and patients alike. We've also been testing the next generation of ambulances and looking to build them. So this is an electric that has around 200 kilometres, which is around 130, 140 miles. But also we're looking at what we could do for the next generation ambulance, zero emission rapid response operational ambulance. This will be launched at COP26, being built by London Ambulance Service and Ulemco. We'll look at how we can have hydrogen and electric, and we'll have around a 300-mile range as well. But we've looked at what we need to do in order to get our vehicles in place, and it's quite a complicated structure having electric vehicles in place, because different ranges, different challenges and different dispatches mean that we need rapid charging, or we could have 7 kilowatt charging or 50 kilowatt charging required. We've also established that we need to look at what we need to do for our infrastructure to support staff and our vehicles off-site as well. So we're working with hospitals, but our infrastructure on site will be very dependent on having a much more integrated system for renewables and having civil contingencies. So having the alternative fuel for the future being battery storage and hydrogen, as well as looking at the other things like ensuring that we flood-proof our buildings, ensure that we have rainwater collection. We look at having wind turbine solar panels, as well as looking at shading for a much warmer future as well. The real challenge for most of the NHS, and especially for the ambulance service, is having a green procurement process and having a supply chain that is green. We need to essentially ensure that we talk to our suppliers and make sure that they have a strategy in place to decarbonise their entire supply chain as well. It's quite complicated, but at the same time, we need to start having these conversations now. 2045 isn't actually that far away in the grand scheme of things. We stand at this junction at this present moment in time. We need to work out, do we take the top path where we superheat our world, or do we take the responsible path and ensure that we can cool our world and ensure that our staff, our patients and our world is a much cooler place, and we can actually control our emissions and reduce the heat that we are generating rather than superheating it. Climate emergency is a health emergency, and us within the health system across the planet have a responsibility to reduce and eliminate our carbon emissions. Thank you very much.
Alexis, how are you?
Good morning. Sorry, my delirium at 5 a.m.
Yeah. I mean, thanks so much for getting up. I mean, that's truly a true commitment to sustainability. So thank you for sharing your time with us here in Australia and New Zealand. We really do appreciate it. And, we look up to you, a 10-year veteran of this, and we're just starting down the journey. So we're really keen to learn from you and the lessons. We don't want to repeat any trials and errors that you may have made along the way. So as a kind of starting point, and we've, as a CAA, we've implemented a sustainability strategy for our services, but really, to be honest, the services are really only just starting on that journey. It's really early days, and although we're starting to see more pressure from our governments to head down this journey, I'm still really keen to understand how do you get sustainability on the ambulance sector agenda?
I think it's been a challenge because we've hidden behind the excuse of many different things like, well, there is no alternatives. The thing is we've gone and we've created the alternatives. We're working with quite a lot of different OEMs to design the ambulances for the future, but it's a whole system approach. So it has to change from the top, it has to change with the chief exec, and it has to change with the paramedic, the patient transport person, and the cleaners at the bottom. So everybody has a responsibility to make those changes. And I'm one sustainability manager. I work closely with Sally, who's in Ambulance Victoria, and Catherine. And it's something which has to be very embedded in the mindset. I think we all need to change, and one person in an organisation of 5,000 people can't make that change. It has to be everybody's mindset that moves.
Absolutely. I was really surprised to see that across the health system that the ambulance sector was a fairly low carbon emitter compared to some of the other services. Why is that? Because, I would have thought on the surface we're running around in thousands of vehicles. Why are we not a larger emitter?
Well, in the UK, and I think probably anywhere else on the planet, most of the carbon emissions from an ambulance service is from the vehicles for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, because it's down to diesel. But for most of the health sector, about 60% is actually down to pharmaceuticals. And the carbon footprint of pharmaceuticals is generally the upstream stuff, so it's where it's shipped from halfway across the planet. It's also the use and the downstream impact, so it's waste that's generated from it. But there's things like anaesthetic gases that can have an enormous impact. There's things that are quite unseen. Anaesthetic gases can last up to 1,000 years in the atmosphere, so the impact is enormous from something that could be just one breath. In the grand scheme of things, the ambulance service is actually a small impact, just purely because our diesel has a different kind of carbon footprint as such. So all of the consumption figures, just looking at face masks, for example, on an annual basis within the UK, we use around 20 million face masks. This year, in the pandemic year, we've used nearly 2 billion. And the waste that's generated, where it's been shipped from, has such an enormous impact that one very insignificant little tiny 3.5 gram face mask can have such a detrimental impact on not just us, but also on fossil fuels, on plastic industry, but also on waste downstream. And I'm sure many who have enjoyed sitting in the sea will have seen some float past as well. So it can have an enormous impact from one very small, insignificant thing.
Absolutely. I've got a question from Steve, which is, when funding is so challenged, how can we prioritise the massive changes required? It's a big question.
It has been a big challenge because sustainability hasn't been at the top of the agenda. So finance hasn't been there, and we have a big issue within the ambulance service, not just in the UK, just to fund the next generation of things that we need to do, like looking at EV charging points, looking at hydrogen refueling stations, which when you start collaborating all the ambulance services around the UK or around Australia, is going to be multi-millions up to billions of pounds to put the infrastructure in. If you can get that infrastructure in, the cost of upgrading the grid in many places could be really challenging, especially in some of the rural parts of Australia. So we're looking at how we can get it more of a national agenda. So it's gone from being a local, can we finance it within our ambulance service, to government, and we've taken it up to the Chancellor to see if we can actually get the finance to support things like that. But the thing is with funding, there's opportunities for it to be a return on investment. So in many cases, replacing a light bulb, if you're replacing it with something that's 60% more efficient, so going from one of the old tungsten ones to an LED light, for example, it's 60 times more efficient than the old one. So your payback, it becomes part of that picture. So the process for sustainability is about proving those business cases all the way from the start, because if you replace like for like, it's always going to be as inefficient. But if you replace it with something that's more efficient and more green, then you can fund it through its own pot as such.
Another question here this one's from Stephanie, and it kind of links to a comment you made a little bit earlier about everybody having to do their bit. What small positive changes can we make at an individual level to contribute to reduced carbon footprint?
On a personal scale, if you start by looking at your carbon footprint, so WWF have a really good carbon footprint element, so you can actually calculate where your carbon is. A lot of it's down to food choices, and one of the very quick things you can do is switch over to a renewables contract. Within the ambulance service, it's about your choices and your waste production, and traveling somewhere for a half an hour meeting that could take 4 hours at either end, is that efficient? It's about how we can change not just the way we function as an organisation, but also the models of care. So there's lots of different things, and it's about questioning the reasons for everything from the start to the finish, but also, as if you are high up in an organisation, questioning the process all the way through, saying, actually, if we renew this contract, is it more efficient? What is the downstream impact, and what kind of improvements can we make? And at some point, even in Australia, you're going to reach a net zero requirement that you will have to look at everything. So it is worthwhile getting into the mindset that we need to change things now.
And that leads really nicely into a question from Jonathan, who's asking, what is your service doing to reduce waste in relation to IV bags and giving sets?
There's a really good project that's going on with looking at PVC, because there's quite a lot of toxic elements that go with IV bags. We haven't started looking at it fully yet, but the Healthcare Without Harm, which is an international sustainability network looking at healthcare mostly in hospital systems, have done some really good assessments to look at that. So there are some international recycling programs to look at the PVC, because it's actually, bar being quite toxic to the patient that's got IV given to them, it can also be recycled all the way through. But it isn't something that's been taken up across the world, but I'm sure it's something you can have a look at. One of the things is quite an essential element, is to talk to the waste producers, i.e. the suppliers, and say, could you take back this waste? Can you recycle it? And question everything that comes through your door. Say, can we go back through a process of getting this recycled and re-looked at, repurposed circular economy?
Neil is interested in, I guess, the impacts of COVID. So there's obviously the negative impacts of COVID, as in the huge waste created by PPE. Have we seen any positive impacts from COVID in relation to this topic?
In the UK, we've seen a massive drive. I think what's happened with COVID in the UK is that it's made people stop, and it's given them a bit of thinking time to think about the important aspects. And climate change hasn't gone away just because a pandemic's arrived. So there's still been flooding, there's still been heat waves, there's still been challenges. And I think because people have stopped doing their normal day-to-day stuff, they've suddenly understood how much of an impact that's been. With the heat waves in America at the present moment in time, your mouse plagues, the various other issues, that it's given people that time and that space to contemplate, do I want to carry on living this way? And with more and more people working from home, it's also made them reassess their kind of working environment as well. From an ambulance perspective, we got hit quite badly. We've sadly lost 5 members of staff to coronavirus. So we've looked at the options to kind of celebrate and support people through the process. It's made us much more of a unified organisation because we're an emergency service. We always deal with emergencies very well, but at the same time, it's made us look at the mental health impacts and the assessment of the process all the way through from start to finish, and made us a lot more resilient from procurement to staff engagement, and looked at lots of different things. On the carbon impact, it's had an impact on use and consumption. It's helped to drive quite a lot of the carbon agenda forwards this year, and with the Greener NHS programme being brought in, it's really pushed it higher up the agenda as well.
I mean, for anything to be successful, we need a few quick wins. What would you suggest are the low-hanging fruit in this space that a service could tackle fairly easily without a lot of cost?
Lighting is one of the starting points for investment programs. As I mentioned, the LED lighting is about 60 to 70% more efficient, so you can actually make financial turns very quickly. We were forced within the NHS to look at going over to renewables last year, so everybody had to be on a renewable contract by April last year, and it's happened. 1.5 million to 3 million in the whole social care network are now running on completely renewable technology. Yeah, there's some really easy things like looking at LED lighting, looking at behavioural change, so getting people to turn off lights, turn off the TV when they leave station, and also looking at the kind of an awareness campaign. It's kind of low-hanging impact, but you get green champions engaged and brought in on the process, which is part of the thing. I'm one person. We have 6 sustainability managers to cover 60,000 people in the UK within the ambulance service. So 5 of us can't turn the lights off in every ambulance station. We need the kind of green army to help us out on that. So there are some really quick, easy ways to have a look at that.
That's great. You put up a nice diagram of a future ambulance station with solar panels and charging points, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about that in a little bit more detail? I'm really interested to know what other innovations we need to be thinking about when planning a new station.
Well, we probably very much like you guys have to have bunkered fuel and the civil contingencies in the event of a disaster of some sort. So we have bunkered fuel on most of our sites, which needs to accommodate us for 20 days. So in the event that we end up with a fuel shortage or locked down stations, whatever it might be. So my kind of vision was, how do we have an ambulance station that runs on electricity, that needs electricity for the vehicles, that might need hydrogen for the vehicles? If you can generate your electricity and store it, solar panels, battery storage, wind turbines, if you can then have a battery storage that feeds into generating hydrogen, so you can actually have that for heating, for cooling, but also for powering your vehicles. But also we need to deal with the climatic changes, so droughts, so we need water storage, which could be for grey water in your toilets, but also looking at how you can water your gardens, water your surrounds, shading to give cooling effects. So it's taking, okay, let's look at a worst case scenario, a 4-degree temperature rise. How do we have an ambulance station that could function with brownouts, super temperatures, flooding, and then saying, okay, how do we accommodate that in a building structure? But also, how can we run and function an ambulance service that could be in a lot of different disaster scenarios? We experience quite a lot of flooding in the UK at the moment, so we need floodgates, we need water storage potentially, but also how can we kind of feed into our local environment of having water storage that could feed out after that. But also at the same time, having low energy, having super insulation, having locations that can accommodate the extremes of electricity demand as well.
I have an interesting question here in relation to, I guess, the other side of the coin, and it's the impact of generating low carbon energy, the chemicals that are used in solar panels, such as lead and cadmium, batteries for storing electricity. There's a whole flip side to the campaign, isn't there? How do you respond to that when challenged?
Yeah, I mean, it's a reality, and it's something that it sits with a lot of the conversations with electric vehicles as well, because a lot of lithium mining is various other things. But at the same time, we are digging up many billions of tons of oil from the ground and using them for the same principle. With most of these rare elements, they are recyclable. It's not foolproof. Obviously, there is a lot of issues that we need to look at, and as mentioned in the chat, there are recycling plants available, which will come, because we can't just stick a load of cadmium and lead in a giant landfill and expect it all to vanish, because that's historical problems that we need to deal with. But also there is a lot of innovation that's going on to kind of get around this, because we are dealing with a lot of modern slavery, a lot of issues across the planet for mining these precious metals, and we need to kind of look at that. It isn't a solution that's going to happen overnight, but at the same time we need to be aware of what that is and strive with every new iteration for a greener technology that we can kind of get in place. And we will reach a point that all of these products will be recycled, or at the same time we'll come up with something that is a greener tech. There are options, and anybody in sustainability really doesn't want to say the O word, but offsetting is one of the issues that we need to look at, but also the kind of carbon sequestration. So planting trees, we have a mass planting programme that's going across the UK to look at that. But we're also looking at things like, so we've got the NHS forest, which has been set up to plant a tree for every single person that works in the NHS. So 1.5 million trees. But there's also NHS Oceans that's been set up as well to look at very similar type of things, because seagrass sequesters around 35 times that of a tree. So if we can look at offsetting as part of the solution, it isn't the solution. We need to look at how we can eliminate the waste and emissions in the first place. It can become part of that zero emissions strategy and vision.
That's certainly a project for us to think about, planting some more trees. We celebrated Sustainability Week by planting a few trees, but only a few, unfortunately. We need to try harder. And my last question, really, just to finish off, is just looking into the future a little bit further. The vehicle of the future for the ambulance sector, do you think it's going to be a combination of different fuel sources in order to get the distances we need, and not reliance on a single energy source?
This has been a challenge for me all the way through my career, because I think we need to have something that's sleek, a sleek design, so very aerodynamic. And the ambulance I mentioned at the beginning, we managed to improve the fuel efficiency by 1 mile to the gallon by changing the aerodynamics. The fuel type needs to be hybrid, I think, because at the moment we have the challenge of having an electric vehicle that can perform, but it will only perform in city centres. Battery technology is improving, and by the end of this year I've been informed that we will have something that can do 300 to 600 miles. But for us as an ambulance service, that doesn't function if you need a 4-hour downtime to refuel, in inverted commas. So recharging is going to be a major challenge. So I think a hydrogen vehicle, which will take 5 minutes to refuel, combined with an electric, might be the part of the solution. There will be other technologies that come on board. Battery replacement has been something that's been looked at. Also, the option of having battery electrolyte. So Shell are looking at a kind of refueling type of system that basically takes your electrolyte out and recharges it with new electrolyte. So there will be lots of different technology that comes on board in the next 5 years that will be viable. What I say to you is don't back one horse. I think there'll be lots of different technologies that come, and each one will have different benefits.
Excellent advice, and thank you for that. So I think we'll close the session off. I mean, you're wide awake now. I'm guessing it's time for your next coffee, then off to work. So from all of us at CAA, and on behalf of our attendees, thank you so much for getting up so early and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. We're on a very exciting journey, I believe. We're convinced that our ambulance services are on this journey too, and we'll continue to look to your service, particularly in relation to, I guess, the benchmark to strive for. So thank you for sharing, and have a great day. Thank you all. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you for attending Sustainable Ambulance with Alexis Percival. Join us for our next webinar on Tuesday the 27th of July for Mechanical Ventilation with Dr. St Clergy. To take a look at all of our upcoming webinars, visit www.caa.net.au/webinars. And be sure to follow us on social media to keep up to date, Twitter at the Council of AM1 and Facebook and LinkedIn the Council of Ambulance Authorities Australasia. Thanks again for joining us and we'll see you next time.